Welcome to another episode of the Vikingology podcast. I'm co-host number one, CJ Adrian.
And I'm co-host number two, Terry Barnes.
And today, while we are in strange locations, not familiar to our listeners and people watching us on YouTube, Terry, you're at your farm, correct?
I am.
And I am in Sun River, Oregon, which is not my normal stomping grounds. As you can probably hear, there's somebody building a deck next door. But I can't go inside because there's a baby and he's loud.
Your
So
world is
that's
full of noise.
It's kind of like, to choose your evil. But today, and as far as guests that we have on the show, we will be turning our focus toward the British Isles once again. And we have with us John Fletcher, who is a historian and a reenactor who is specialized in Southwest Britain. I imagine that's going to be something like Cornwall, right? We'll have lots of fun things to talk about there. And his first book, The Western Kingdom, which was published in 2023, is out for sale. And then he's currently researching the impact of Viking and Scandinavian activity in the southwest part of England, from the 9th through 11th century. There we go. I hope I did your work justice. John, welcome on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. That was such a nice introduction. I can't imagine critiquing it for a second.
Since you wrote it.
Hey, we don't reinvent the wheel here. I will say, wait, I did see something really cool recently, just to go on an aside, but it has to do with the British Isles. So for anyone not familiar, this goes way back into kind of deeper history. So before the Beaker people, which was a migration from the continent into the British Isles, there was somebody else there. I forget their name. They're the ones who built Stonehenge and those sorts of things. And they didn't have the wheel. Evidently, this is what I heard through and I mean, listeners, if I'm wrong about anything, put it in the comments. This is not my expertise. This is just something that was kind of cool that I thought was fun. So because they didn't have the wheel, then it was pretty obvious that they weren't connected to all of the trade networks in continental Europe, and they'd cut themselves off from it. And so archaeologists were always scratching their heads like, why would you do this? It's like shooting yourself in the foot. You're going to miss out on technological innovations that people on the continent are going to have. And then it spelled their demise, because when the Beaker people came over, they had a bunch of technology that helped them to replace the people that were there before. But in archaeological findings, they found that there was evidence of bubonic plague. And it appears that they may have cut themselves off from the continent because they realized that people from the continent were bringing plague. How interesting is that?
Very. I actually have in my notes to ask about the plague, to ask John about the plague. So
is the first Brexit.
The first Brexit.
So, John, give us a high-level dive into your focus and how you got into it. How did you get into this particular niche in the Viking Age?
Yeah, sure. So basically, it all comes back to when I went to university. So I'm originally from the States. My accent doesn't necessarily betray that anymore, but I moved over to a part of England called Cambridge, stayed there for a long time, and then I went to university in a city called Plymouth, which is, for your American audiences, where the Pilgrims left from. It was their final stop. There's the Mayflower Steps, all that sort of stuff there. It's in the far southwest.
Also where they landed.
Yeah, it's also conveniently for them. Like, hey, we're home.
There's only so many names to go around. Yeah, so Plymouth is basically the furthest west in what is properly England before you're then crossing the Tamar and going into Cornwall. So I had this kind of vague idea that Cornwall and the Cornish weren't the same as English people historically. They were more similar to the Welsh. And being a reenactor at the time already and doing Viking reenactment, I thought, oh, okay, well, maybe there's something in that I could like do a persona based on somebody who's more Brittonic rather than somebody who's necessarily an Anglo-Saxon. And I started looking into it, and the more I looked into it, the more interesting it was, the more I felt that it was underappreciated. I mean, there were people who would writing about it a little bit, but they tended to either be sort of Cornish nationalists who obviously had an agenda of their own to push, or they were sort of the older kind of English authors and historians, where everyone on the British Isles who isn't English is, some kind of inferior race, and it's about the sort of glorious ascent of the Germanic incomers. I mean, that's really how old some of these books were. You're talking 1800s, early 1900s. And other than that, like there hadn't been a huge amount, but there was lots of stuff in the sources we had, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in sort of some of the archaeology, in the in the Welsh annals that mentioned Cornwall and the southwest, that talked about these stories, and it was all there. It's not like I discovered anything, but it didn't feel like people were really talking about the links between all of those. And obviously, the elephant in the room when you talk about the early medieval period in the southwest is King Arthur. So unfortunately, there is a vast and never-ending sea of sort of books and writing about King Arthur and the Southwest and all this, which there are a couple of good ones. I mean, like Guy Halsell's Worlds of Arthur, I think it's called, is very good. There's a couple others that sort of deal with it more holistically. And then there's just a lot of absolute nonsense. So I think that kind of, again, buried a lot of the really interesting stuff underneath everyone trying to link it back to some kind of King Arthur unifying mythos in the Southwest. But yeah, it's kind of a shame because the Southwest, you talk about maybe these early people didn't have the wheel, but to a certain extent, you almost wouldn't need a wheel in the Southwest because you're not going overland anywhere for the most part. For your writers who aren't familiar, you basically have it's the bit that kind of comes off Britain at an angle. You got Wales up here, things like that. It's a peninsula. Cornwall, for example, literally means corn, which comes from the Latin for horn or peninsula. And then wall, which is Wales, so the same root word as Welsh. So it's literally the peninsula where British people live, basically. Um,
Oh, I was going to ask if we know how old that etymology is for Cornwall, because in the Brittany region of France, for example, they have a town called Cornouailles, which is a Frenchified version of Cornwall, and the idea there would be that Cornish people came down at some point, the Britons during the Germanic invasion, and then lent some place names to the Brittany region from that area. So does Cornwall go back that far?
Yeah, it doesn't. It's particularly the corn part because that is a Latin root word. It goes back to sort of the Roman times. It causes problems because the Romans called the people who lived in Cornwall itself the Cornovii, which basically just means the people who live on a peninsula. But they also called at least one other group in Britain the same thing because there was just another group of people who lived in the peninsula. But no, the Brittany example is really interesting because there also was a region called Domonique, which comes from Demonia, which is the sort of the wider area, potentially links back to the early name for Devon. Links between those two areas, and this is kind of where I was going with the overland stuff. Traveling by sea, you've got lots of coastline. It's really lots of rivers, very easy to travel on that. Traveling overland, you've got moors, you've got the Somerset levels. I always sort of bring it back to this. In 2015, many of listeners may not be familiar with this. There was really massive floods in the United Kingdom, and actually the entire southwest was cut off from the rest of England. You couldn't get a train or a car from Cornwall into London. You could get a helicopter or a plane potentially, but there was no other way of translating. And that was actually a return to what it used to be like. Barry Cunliffe wrote a very big book about the Iron Age Celtic peoples in Europe. And one of his points that he pulled out was actually there is more similarities between the Britons of the Southwest and the Britons of Armorica, what will become Brittany, even in the Iron Age, than there are between the Britons of the Southwest and other Britons. They are very much sort of down on their end, not isolated, because that's the sort of flip side. People tend to think, oh, you're right at the end of the world. You're isolated. You're not. You're linked by the sea. You're looking outwards. You're sailing. You're going out to find people and to find trade, because we know, for example, they were trading tin, which is their major resource throughout Devon and Cornwall, with the Mediterranean, right into the Bronze Age. They pulled a bunch of tin ingots from the sea outside of Haifa in Israel from the Bronze Age, and the metalwork regarding them actually shows that they were from Cornwall. So they've traveled all the way into the Mediterranean. And that was going on in the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and in the early medieval period. They were still primarily trading tin.
So with the etymology of the word, I'm like once again sucked into the Last Kingdom, and they call it Cornwallum. Is that real, or is that a Bernard Cornwell makeup word?
No, that's a makeup word. So the Anglo-Saxons tend to just call them the Wales. So the Wales just means Britain. So they just call them the Wales. You have to kind of read in context who they're referring to. They occasionally use the phrase West Wales, so as in the Welsh people who live in the west rather than the ones who live in the north bit. But that's actually only, I think, 2 or 3 times the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that comes up. So yeah, no, Cornwallum is just him going off on one. In Welsh and Cornish sources, it's Cernu, so Cernieu, and that eventually will morph into the modern day Cornish word, which is Kernow, which is Kernow.
Well, so he does use the word Welas to refer
Yeah.
to the Welsh. I noticed that. But then also another depiction that's got me curious to then too is sort of like, okay, everything's pitted, or sort of relative to, the dudes from Wessex, right? Who are awesome, right? In their own estimation. So when they're like venturing over to Cornwallum or even to Wellas and they run into like some of those petty kings over there, it's sort of like, Hicks from the sticks out here in the middle of nowhere. So is that a fair depiction for how is it always been viewed that way in the British Isles?
No, absolutely not. In actual fact, one of the things which is so, I would say, tragic for people who are big fans of the Anglo-Saxons about the misunderstandings of the Britons in the Southwest is that it massively undercuts just how clever the kings, other than Alfred, and just how successful the kings of Wessex were at various times. Because when Wessex enters the kind of the world stage, if you like, or enters British politics, if you want to call it that, it's a fairly latecomer. So it's actually surrounded by other Anglo-Saxon polities. It's not got lots of, panicking Romano Britons or, a pre-established power base like some of the early Anglo-Saxons might have had. It comes into the Thames Valley. Over its sort of early history, it has to fight a lot of battles with other Anglo-Saxons. Its first entry is actually fighting the South Saxons, and potentially, depending which version you read of the Chronicle, raiding the Isle of Wight and killing everybody who lived there. And over time, what they do is, as you've got sort of Northumbria and Mercia and these other polities getting more powerful, the West Saxons turn west and they start pushing west, fighting at first other sort of scattered, smaller sort of groups. So there's a very famous entry where one of their kings is fighting basically the local kings of like Bath, and 2 other cities. So these are like small city-based power bases, but he fights all 3 of them and he wins and he moves his forces further west. It's not until actually they get to the border around where we think the border with Demonia was. Obviously, borders are very hazy things in this period, because it's really hard to say where one group ends and another begins. And to be honest, even people living at the time, it's probably whoever you're paying taxes to on the day. You're not that tied into a national narrative. But once they reach there, it starts to grind much more to a halt. They're actually now fighting somebody who's much more on their level. And for the Britons in the Southwest, if anything, the Anglo-Saxons were the Hicks, because to their minds, they were the inheritors of Rome. They still had contact with the Roman world. We know they were importing Byzantine pottery. They were importing Byzantine goods, so wine, olive oil. They were reusing them. So we found stoppers where they've reused amphora for their own items. So to them, yeah, these sort of barbarians who had come in, and to be completely fair to the Anglo-Saxons, the common understanding of them as these kind of hairy, fur-wearing guys is also incorrect, and they would have been a much more complicated society. But there would have been no doubt for the Britons that they were the inheritors of Rome, and these were the outsiders. These were the uncultured kind of people. And then it's funny because obviously Wessex, increasingly as these other groups, takes on imperial symbols, like they use the dragon banner, and things like that to kind of reinforce their own images. No, actually, we're the ones who are inheriting Rome and have the power here.
Alfred was brilliant at that, I have to say.
Yeah.
So this is really interesting. The parallels with the Brittany region of France
Mhm.
are tremendous. I mean, everything you're saying is, I mean, could be said about Brittany. The
Mhm.
inheritors of the Roman Empire, the last holdouts after the invasion of the Germanic Franks. They repelled first the Frankish invasions, then the Viking invasions, but then they had kind of like in my books, I talk a lot about how they still, the royal elites still wear robes that look like togas. Like they're still, they still think of themselves very much as Romans. And so it sounds like in Cornwall it's the same. So from a military standpoint, like in terms of like say arms and armor, that's something that I explored in depth, wondering what did the Bretons of the ninth century wear in terms of their gear, their kits, and in researching, they kept a lot of the same things as the Roman equites, right? So you have the oblong shields and the some mail and this sort of thing. So would the Cornwallians, Corn,
The
the
Cornish?
Just Cornish.
Cornish. Sorry. Oh gosh, I know better. Why did I fumble on that one? I have a 20-month-old who's very active, and he has scattered my brain to no end. So I'm trying. But anyway, would the Cornish have perhaps looked and felt similar to that?
Yeah, I think certainly. I mean, it's very hard to say because while one of the tricky things when you're studying particularly non-Anglo-Saxon inhabitants of Britain this time is that Ken Dark put forward a paper on this. Not only do they practice unfurnished burial as a custom generally, you get some furnished burials, but not loads. It seems to become more prevalent that they bury the dead with nothing going forward. And he suggested this is basically a response to the Anglo-Saxons coming in and showing them that the correct Christian thing to do is to not take anything with you to the next life. So they're making it outward, which is a great point for them, but makes it really difficult for us. But I think when you look at, we've got a couple of things. We've got from Tintagel, there's slate sort of doodles almost. Somebody has sat there and just carved into a slate a warrior, a very, shall we say, excited dog, and a few other sort of things. And you can sort of see he's wearing something that's probably armor. He's carrying a shield. I think generally we would expect them to be armed and armored very similarly to the Anglo-Saxons, because both the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons have the same experience of that Roman war machine, the sort of late Empire, late Roman war machine. So they are wearing mail armor. They're carrying round shields, carrying sort of swords. We don't have a Cornish sword. We've got sword pieces from Exeter and from Cornwall, which again tie pretty broadly into the wider Northern European typologies. So it looks like they're kind of using those long swords. Spears, almost certainly, because everybody's using spears. What we do know is that the Britons generally, and certainly the Southwest Britons, put more heroic emphasis on cavalry fighting or fighting from horseback. That's not to say the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings eventually don't fight on horseback. That's a common misconception. When appropriate, they do. But their stories, their sagas largely emphasize fighting on foot. So, Beowulf wrestles with Grendel. The Battle of Maldon, I've lost his name. The leader sends his horses away as it's like a major point in the poem. Whereas we have a poem called Geraint ab Urban, so Geraint, son of Urban, which is probably about the Battle of Longborth in 710, which is probably Langport in Somerset, which I've sort of, for reasons I put out in my book, where basically the recurring stanza is things like, at Longborth, I saw horses white with foam, and the rage of the slaughter and swords clashing. So it's all sort of horses. It keeps coming back to this horse-based, this idea of this glorious charge. You see the same thing in Wygotodden, which I'm butchering, so my Welsh isn't very good. But again, it talks about the warriors kind of riding to battle. Although there you also have one stanza where one of the warriors is in very much a shield wall. So it does show they do fight in a very similar Northern European way as the Anglo-Saxons. But the emphasis is much more on that mounted combat, that sort of idea of these guys of riding off to battle. And that probably comes back to the idea of British kingship, certainly in Wales and the north, less so probably down in the southwest because of the geography, but it is more of a mobile court. So you have the king and his taili, which is his kind of close retainers, would ride between various courts. So the kingdom is almost more focused around where the king is. It's not necessarily I will build a palace here and stay there. I might have 4 or 5 places where I'm going. So, for example, in Cornish, the word lis denotes a court. So today there's a town which you almost can't avoid going through if you're coming from England to Cornwall, called Liscard, which is right in Crossroads. And that's literally, again, the court here. And, the bishop's house is also called basically the bishop's list, the bishop's court. So, yeah, there's that kind of idea. And it's interesting because obviously when we talk about Brittany, the traditional kind of story, the traditional idea is that was founded by Britons, particularly from the southwest, fleeing the Anglo-Saxons. But as you'll know, the founding dates when the Britons start arriving are way before the Anglo-Saxons are anywhere near the southwest. It takes a couple hundred years for them to sort of go from the east coast of Britain and the north of Britain and then move west. Like I said, Wessex first is fighting other Anglo-Saxons and starts to move west after that. And the thing is, refugee populations don't replace native populations. They don't completely usurp the language of an area. What you're actually talking about there is colonization. That's something that took money, that took manpower, that took a concerted effort by a central power base of some kind to fund all that. And that's supported by Brittany isn't the only place that has one of these colonies. If you go across to Galicia in northern Spain, there's another settlement of Britons there that appears at around the same time. Today, it basically still only survives as a bishopric, which the Pope can bestow on somebody as Bishop of the Britons in that part of the world. But the interesting other factor to look at is, what do all three of these areas, the Southwest Britain, Northwestern France, and Northern Spain, have in common? That's where the tin is. So all three are the only easily accessible tin lodes in Northern Europe. And that's where Britain settlements are springing up in this kind of post-world.
Wow, it's
Yeah,
like the early industrial revolution, like, the iron and coal, later centuries.
Yeah.
But can I just at one point of clarification on time?
Mhm.
Since you're talking about people believing they're the inheritors of Rome, which falls, as many of our listeners probably know, sort of late 5th century. But then I'm
Mhm.
talking about Alfred, and he's like late 9th century. So it's
Yeah.
like all of this development is going on like that entire time, or
So what happens is we have the immediate post-Roman period where probably the Britons of the Southwest are relatively untroubled by what the Anglo-Saxons are doing because they're still the other side of the country. There's lots of other Britain or Romano-British polities between them and the Anglo-Saxons. That's when you've got this kind of colonization space. You've got people going to Brittany, you've got people going to Galicia. Something happens in the sort of 5th to 6th century. You mentioned the plague. So the plague of Justinian is one possible candidate. There are hints, I think, in Gildas, although this isn't enough to write a book or a theory about, that there is some kind of dynastic struggle in Southwest in Daemonia, because Gildas in his De Exidio, which many of us may be familiar with, he basically berates the various kings of Britain in his time. So we're talking sort of the 6th century. When he's berating the Constantine, the king of Daemonia, is the only time he mentions a woman directly, other than Boudica in his historic rant about the state of Britain. He calls her the Lioness of Daemonia, basically, and in Christian parlance of the time, that is not a compliment. That's very much supposed to be like this horrible demon woman. He accuses Constantine of murdering his two nephews, simultaneously saying that they were innocent children, but also they looked great when they were bearing arms, which doesn't really make sense. And we know that Gildas himself ends his life in Brittany, not in his native Britain. So I suspect there may have been some kind of dynastic power struggle around this time where the factions kind of split, and that might feed into why Brittany goes off more completely on its own, where it might have had stronger links once upon a time with the Southwest.
yeah, this all tracks. If you think about pre-Roman Britain, right? And I did a whole course through the great courses on the Celts, the British Isles. What was interesting was that the people in what's now England were not ethnically Celtic. They had picked up Celtic language and culture through exchange with the continent.
Yeah.
And then if you play that forward a little bit, and what you said about the tin connecting Cornwall with Brittany and Galicia, and in fact, the Irish Book of Settlements implies that the Celts who populated Ireland came from Spain. So this, it's all kind of ties in together in this muddy people, population movements over time. Terry and I have talked about this a lot on the podcast. But that's really cool. Yeah, the it's interesting what you bring up about kind of that idea that Britons fleeing the Anglo-Saxons went into Brittany and then Galicia, which is kind of what it's kind of like the fifth grade level. This is what happened.
Yeah.
But then when you examine, the first Atlantic Wall, which the Romans built to repel the Franks, which was happening during their withdrawal from Britain, like the historian in France, Jean-Christophe Gassal, makes it very clear. Really, what we're talking about is there's a small group of people from Southwest Britain who were conscripts in the Roman army, and when the withdrawal happened, it wasn't that people were fleeing Britain, it's that the soldiers who were stationed in Brittany from the British Isles were cut off and couldn't go home. And then they
Yeah.
stayed and then fought, then had families and that sort of thing. And so it's kind of interesting how that all plays out. But then with your suggestion of the tin, the exchange, then we can imagine that there was a lot of mixing before that, and then after that as well, because who's going to stop? Even the Anglo-Saxons coming in are going to say, well, let's just stop this trade because we don't want to be rich.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's like it. And I mean, moving towards Alfred's time, you do see the sort of steady creep west of Wessex keeps going, and probably that was on their minds that there is this mineral wealth in the southwest that they could then hopefully exploit. I mean, Devon is also, particularly Devon, is also very rich agriculturally, which is very important for an agricultural society, obviously. But yeah, they kind of continue. And it's funny, Ecbert, who is Alfred's, I believe, grandfather, potentially great-grandfather, who's a very powerful king of Wessex. He's the one who basically leaves Alfred a kingdom which is capable of holding off the Viking invasions. He spends a lot of his time fighting the Southwest Britons. He tends to get discussed much more in the fact that he overcame Mercia and the Mercian sort of hegemony, which he did, absolutely accurate. But the year of the Battle of Ellendun, actually, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, there is a record of a battle in the southwest where basically a place called Gaffelforda in Old English, or Galford. It just says the men of the Defnas, so the men of Devon in Anglo-Saxon, and the Britons fought. Basically, there's no recorded victor, but we have charters from that time, well, I should rephrase this. We have two charters, one of which is probably a fake, which is one of the problems with Anglo-Saxon charters, but copying a valid dedication from a different charter. And the dedication, which is valid, it basically says, I, Ecbert, among the army at Credinthro, which is Crediton in Devon, assign these lands, blah, blah, blah. So that means that in the same year that he was planning to go and confront the most powerful kingdom of his day in Mercia, he had to take a detour into the very far southwest of his kingdom to confront the Southwest Britons. And I think that does drive home that far from kind of being a really easy victory that the West Saxons just kind of conquered the Britons and moved on, this was still seen as a real threat to his power and his kingdom. Potentially, obviously, the Britons had overwhelmed the local fyrd or the local army at Galford, and were then moving back into areas of Devon, and he went to confront them, something like that. But yeah, as I say, it's the same year, the most pivotal battle of his life is due to be. He probably doesn't want to be in the far southwest of his kingdom. He probably wants to be somewhere completely different.
So is the period of time in your book primarily like migration period?
No, it goes from sort of 7-9, so from the 5th century right through to post 1066.
Okay,
because yeah, it kind of. Sorry, I've kind of gone over the migration stuff, but if we move to Vikings, what kind of happens is Ecbert keeps attacking, keeps hammering the Britons, and it gets to the early 9th century, sort of around the 820s, and then the Vikings appear on the scene in the Irish Sea, realistically. So probably Wexford and Westford in Ireland are being founded around this time. Viking longships are starting to prowl the Irish Sea. And in, I think, 820 or 822, they fight Ecbert in North Devon at a place called Carhampton, and they win. They defeat Ecbert, which is unusual for Ecbert. He's very good at killing people. And I think a bishop dies, which gives you an indication of how bad things must have gotten, because probably they were fleeing. You wouldn't expect a bishop to be anywhere near the actual front rank of fighting. And from that, quite soon afterwards, we have another entry. So about 10 years goes by, which for Anglo-Saxon, for early medieval history, isn't that long a time. And the Vikings reappear, and this time it's a fleet of Viking ships land amongst the West Welsh in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, join with them, and they make war upon Ecbert. So they ally with what would have been the Cornish by that point, no longer Demonia, and they invade Ecbert's kingdom. So they invade Wessex. They go on the warpath. And this is actually the very first time in British history where a Viking fleet allies itself with a local power against another local power. Now, eventually, that will become relatively common. They do it a lot in Wales. They do it between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But this is the very first time, and it's really significant. They get to a place called Hingston or Hengistun, Hengist Hill, essentially. And then Egbert meets them in battle and defeats them because he is really good at killing people. But that's sort of the last confirmed battle between Cornwall and Wessex.
On his gravestone, he was really good at killing people.
I mean,
Here lies Egbert, good at kill. Well, I mean, knights in the Middle Ages, that was their job, right? But you were evaluated on your ability. So, John, what year are we talking about for this first alliance?
So that's 838.
So is that the first recorded, or the first? Do you really think it was the first?
First recorded, certainly. I mean, you find lots of fairly early Scandinavian artifacts around the southwest coast. So we have a lot of like Bora style decorated metalwork, for example, which obviously, and given what we know about, as I said, sort of that the sea trade being so important to people in the southwest, it's almost impossible that they weren't in contact with the Vikings fairly early on, because particularly those ones that were exploring Southern Ireland would have been in that Southern Irish sea space where the Southwest Britons were also operating and trading. So potentially it could have happened much earlier, but yeah, certainly the first recorded instance. What's really interesting, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's really interesting about this battle. I wrote a paper about it for that reason. But one of the really interesting things is it's usually used as like a real like dead point. Like at this point, the West Britons are under Wessex's control. That's it. End of story. But then there are no charters. There's no giving out of land. When Alfred's building his burhs, the furthest west he builds is at Lidford in Devon, which is not only exactly on the modern day border between Devon and Cornwall, it is halfway up the country. So this isn't a coastal defense. This is in the middle of the peninsula. So it looks like it's guarding almost as much west as it is guarding the sea and the approach of the Vikings. So certainly Alfred doesn't believe that the Cornish are necessarily his friends, or doesn't trust that they're his friends, I guess. And what we continue to see is a lot of actual Scandinavian or potential Scandinavian activity in Cornwall during this period. There's a really fascinating book called De Reris Fabulis on Uncommon Tales, which is currently it's in the Oxford Posterior Codex, if anybody wants to look that up. But it was probably written in Cornwall from the analysis they've done. And the very front page of it has Futhok, the younger Futhok on it. So it has written runes in it. And they've written it in code as well. So this isn't somebody just passingly familiar, or maybe he saw some runes one time on like a sword or something. This is somebody actually wrote and encoded a message against it. So probably somebody very intimately familiar with the writing system. The text itself is basically a primer for monks to learn Latin. So if you've ever done like a language course, it'll be quite familiar. It's like, I want to eat. What do you want to eat? Beef, pork, chicken, blah, 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 a list of things. But one of the interesting ones is there's, my lord, I have word of the battle. And it's like, oh, the battle? And he goes, yeah. And it's like, it was a great victory over the sort of Saxons or something like that. So it has this kind of messaging in it as well, and then you start to think maybe it was sort of the 9th century. Is this somebody who was at Hingston Down, or their father was at Hingston Down and is now sort of sneaking this stuff in? So it's really interesting.
What was the name? What was the name of one of the people that you just mentioned a while back? Anyway, I lost it, but I was totally thinking it sounded like a name that would be a character in your book, CJ. It was like interesting. Oh, anyway.
I mean, there are a lot of characters in my book. I think the Alliance thing, 838, when you think about everything that's going on, like in Brittany, for example, which is just a hop and a skip away, if you think about it.
Yeah.
For 843, you have the sack of Nantes, but that happened after a battle between the Bretons and the Franks. And then the Count Renaud was slain in battle. And then the Vikings, who were allied with the Bretons, thought, well, since no one's defending the city anymore, we're just going to go ahead and take it. and that alliance did not go well. But it seems like, we one of the things I've explored a lot is this idea that the Vikings started peripherally, and they weren't particularly successful against established military polities like, say, the Frankish Empire.
Mm.
Even some of the British ones, right? The like Wessex and Northumbria. They started with small groups and they didn't really start with the larger groups until later. And I've always thought of Brittany as kind of their playing ground, whereas the first, and Ireland as well, where they showed up and started trying to do things. They started trying to get a little creative with what they were doing instead of just raiding. Let's try and take over this, this node, right? Let's try and take over this area. Let's set up a long port. Let's do this, right? And so it sounds like Cornwall may have been a bit of a sandbox for them as well on, learning how to approach these different places so that they could be more successful militarily. I mean, because I feel like in Brittany, that's really like in 847. So this is almost 10 years later. There were three successive battles where they won against the Bretons, but they didn't invade ultimately because we don't really know, but it's probably because their supply lines were cut off in Ireland.
Yeah.
And that shows the interconnectedness as well. So do you see Cornwall as kind of this or Southwest England as a sort of sandbox? Do you have any other examples that might support that?
Yeah. So I think the key thing always with the Vikings, particularly when we're talking about actual Vikings, so sort of early raiders rather than the sort of later established kingdoms, is they're opportunists, right? So if there's an opportunity, they will take it. So like with Nance, if the local army is defeated in front of you, yeah, sure, steal the city. Like we're here, why not? I think if they can't fight or they don't think they fight, they might try to trade first. They do obviously establish vast trading networks by that. I think the interesting thing with Cornwall in particular, and particularly the North Coast, which is the one they're probably most coming up against, is it's a very beautiful part of the United Kingdom. Some of your readers may have gone there. It tends to be quite picturesque because what tends to happen is you have a beautiful beach at the bottom of extremely steep cliffs. So you have kind of these very narrow paths that kind of wind down to the beachfront, or like a little tiny village nestled in there. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that the Cornish had spent the migration period that we can see dealing with a lot of Irish raiders. So the Irish didn't always just get raided by Vikings; they were doing quite a lot of raiding of their own in the Irish Sea. So they were used to a certain extent dealing with shipborne raiders. So I think one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of records of raids and like battles in Cornwall between Vikings and Cornish. There's one example in 980, 980 something, where Padstow, which is a large monastery town, gets burnt down, possibly by Olaf Tryggvason. But that's kind of it. Like there's not a huge number of raids. Harold Godwinson does more recorded raiding in Cornwall than the Vikings do. But I think part of the reason is that if you rock up in your longship and you park on one of these beaches, and then the locals are probably already looking at the sea, so they might have already gathered together a bunch of dudes with spears and shields to stand on top of the cliff and look down at you. Your first reaction maybe at that point is let's talk about it, let's trade, let's do something. And I think as time went on, what became more of the case was having a safe port that close to Wessex would have been invaluable. So having somewhere where, right, maybe you're not in political control, maybe you haven't taken over, or Cornwall's not a great place to build big cities. We only actually have one city in Cornwall even today. So you're maybe not building like a big, massive base. But if you have those safe ports, then it gives you somewhere to go. And interestingly, there's a hoard of treasure called the Trewhiddle Hoard, which is just on the south coast of Cornwall, was buried in a tin working. And it was originally recorded as being hidden from the Vikings. But actually, when you look at the stuff that's in there, so there's like an Irish silver chalice, there are coins from Wessex and Mercia. There is silver from Ireland, the silver from France. There's all sorts of bits all from all over the sort of North Sea, Irish Sea region. That's the only person who probably had access to that was a Viking, which means he buried it in Cornwall, probably thinking that would be a safe place to put it and come back for it later. Interestingly, the timeline puts it right around the big battle between Alfred and Guthrum when Alfred emerges out of the marshes. So it's really tempting to put it like maybe he buried it, went to that battle, and then got killed. But yeah, whatever the case, the most likely person is a Viking raider having deposited that.
So CJ, I
Yeah.
want to ask you then about that, what you just said there about the sandbox thing. Because when I think of that kind of a concept, I think of, okay, beginners or the beginning of something, right? And they're sort of figuring things out. And it's just sort of, I don't know. I'm honestly sort of thought experimenting my way into this period of time and just sort of like, okay, well, what if it's just these dudes who like, it isn't really a sandbox. They're just there and they're just going to do whatever they can to take whatever they can, etc. Or if it's a sandbox, it means they're practicing and building up for something else, something bigger. So like
So,
what do you imagine the eyes on the prize would be then?
yeah, I mean, some kind of broader broader strategy. So I go back to this idea that these are small groups of people that are trying to do really big things. So the idea that they all the ship captains may have known each other in some way, shape, or form, right? Kind of like I have that reflected in my books, where the first trip they take to Brittany, they go from Ireland to Brittany, and then they're just one ship and they're trading, but then a fleet arrives and it's 8 ships and it's with another Viking, and then they're thinking, oh well, they're going to kill us because they that's what you do. They're like, oh, they got to. And then only to realize that one of the main characters on the boat recognize, hey, that's my cousin. Oh, hey, and then they stop and and then they're like, let's join forces, so it's like these are so my idea, and this is arguable, of course. This is just kind of my concept that I put into my books, really. But from all that I've seen is, for me, there's a definite progression of activity, and it starts all the way back, but then we're talking about different generations too, adopting these ideas and having to carry them forward. But if you look at the Brittany region specifically, and you have the raids on Noirmoutier, for example, which essentially end around 836 after the monks abandoned the island. It's not that the raids ended, it's that the monks left, so they stopped recording anything. And then and we know economic activity on the island persisted, but then after that they went from the coast and then they started attacking inland. And you see Nantes in 843, Paris in 845. And so it's around that time that you see in 840, and after Paris in 847, there's a mainland invasion of Brittany with an entire army that arrives that the Bretons have to fight off. And they lose 3 successive battles, and it looks bad for them. And luckily, and now we don't know if this is connected or not, I think it is. I just it's kind of like, the chronology has to fit, and unfortunately, some of the dates we're not sure. But at the same time, in Ireland, the Irish essentially, I wouldn't say rebelled, but they basically said, "Hey, we don't want these Longports here because you guys are jerks." And so the Irish rose up and fought 3 successive battles with the Vikings, right? And pushed them out. So for me, there's a progression, and I think for me, there's a rationale behind what they're trying to accomplish. And then you do start to see, and then like shortly after that, I think it's only 15 years after that, you get the Great Heathen Army in England. So and that might have something to do with the changing political landscape in Scandinavia, the consolidation of power by larger and larger monarchs. Because in 838, for example, there's I forget which document says that King Horik dies in the islands of Aquitaine, right? And that was from Michel d'Irange, and I forget where he got that from. But this idea that now you have a king that's visiting, and also if you go to Denmark, what do you mean King Horik died in 838? So what King Horik? Which King Horik? And it gets confusing, but I think yeah, I don't know if I'm expressing this correctly, but it's like, to me, from when you look at everything and you see, maybe I'm just seeing things, but I feel like there's a definite progression of activity.
Yeah.
Therefore, Brittany kind of serves as a sandbox. And then when they're done with Brittany, um, like for example, you fast forward to 926, I think it was, when Alain Barbetorte, the Breton king,
Mhm.
did a reconquista of Brittany, right? Because it had been occupied by the Vikings for 30 years.
Yeah.
And they reconquered Brittany and realized that, wait, there's not very many of them. And then when they took Nantes back, the city was left completely derelict. The Vikings had made no effort to turn it into a flourishing trade center, as they had done, for example, in Jorvik. And so to me, it shows that Brittany wasn't valuable. It wasn't the end goal, ultimately. Or something catastrophic happened within their own that we don't know about that caused that. So it's kind of a mystery, but, anyway.
Yeah.
I think I'm getting there.
I mean, obviously, the interesting thing about Alan, I'm not going to try and say his second name, but Curlybeard, is that his reconquest is in part funded by Athelstan. Um, and one of the things that I don't think people always appreciate about Athelstan is one of the ways he's really achieves becoming the king of all Britain, not just the king of the English, is that he recognizes the Britons and the Scots as a separate people, and he's happy to leave them with their own kings, their own rulers, in place if they accept him as their overlord, basically, and pay him taxes. Doesn't work out very well with the Scots; they rebel fairly quickly, but it works relatively well with Hywel of the Welsh, and we have this record of Hywel of the West Welsh agreeing to this as well, potentially a Cornish monarch. And to me, I've always sort of wondered, when you look at sort of his foster children, he's got like the Prince of Norway. He's got, he marries his sister into the court of the Franks. He is big, and then there's Alan and the Bretons. And I've always sort of wondered, why that? And I think for me, it's potentially that he recognized Brittany and the Bretons there as linked into this wider sort of Brittonic world, and maybe he felt if he supported their claim and helped raise Alan, could he then eventually, like he did with the others, get another area where he is overlord and a foothold into the continental one? So I've always thought that was a really interesting fact that he gave them a bunch of ships and men to go help with that.
Well, in Brittany always, I mean, if you look at the 100 Years' War, for example, and then Brittany was
Yeah.
constantly on the English side, right? And they didn't have to try that hard. It's like, we're coming to invade France. The Bretons would be like, aha! We're with you. We're with you immediately. We hate the French. Yeah. Well, it's so, Terry, back to the question about the sandbox. Also, one more thing to add to that is I do call the invasion in 847 the Great Heathen Army before the Great Heathen Army, because the way that it's described is it's kind of the first major fleet to show up to try a mainland invasion of a territory that we haven't that hadn't been seen before. I don't think. Correct me if I'm wrong. If there's another place where they went in and completely took over. But to me, it looked, if you look at the 847, they weren't just going for like Paris and then leaving, or Nantes and leaving. They arrived with ships, supplies, people, and then they fought the Bretons in successive battles. You think after one battle they'd take a city and leave, if that's what they're there to do. It looks like they were there to stay, and that was their first attempt, and it failed for one reason or another, which are still not very clear. But when I call it the Great Heathen Army before the Great Heathen Army, if you think about who they were fighting in Brittany at the time, they would have been much closer culturally, linguistically, and perhaps militarily to the people in the British Isles. And so then they kind of get a test case of, hey, here's what went right. They could have transmitted those ideas back to Scandinavia and say, here's what went right in Brittany, here's what went wrong. We also have on the island of Groix, and this is really interesting, the ship burial there. They found shield bosses that had been remade and repurposed into different shapes. And the idea is that as they were fighting the Celts in Brittany, they were learning their tactics and adapting their arms and armor to suit those. And then by the time you get to 867, I believe it is, for the Great Heathen Army, right? They're just ready to crush anyone. So I could be off with that, but that's where kind of my sandbox idea. I call it the Great Heathen Army before the Great Heathen Army. And now in Cornwall, it seems like they were doing the same thing where they allied. That's even more significant, I feel like. In 838, they ally with the Cornish, right, and have some successes. And it seems like they're there kind of to do more than just hit and run.
Yeah, and I think that's the end game for the Cornish, I think, is pretty obvious. Is to reclaim territory in Devon, which was only relatively recently, sort of 815, conquered by Wessex. For a long time, you've got Dartmoor, which is basically bang in the center of Devon, probably creating quite a big natural barrier. But eventually, Ecgbert does move past that. I think if you look at the end game for the Vikings, I mean, probably the raiding, particularly of Plympton, which is a suburb of modern day Plymouth near where I live, which is a tin trading area. There was probably a lot of disposable wealth there that they could grab. So that was probably the initial thing. But then you are probably looking at, okay, can we start making a foothold? Can we establish things? As I said, we've got Scandinavian stonework in Cornwall, particularly clustered around the north coast. We from the later period we even have hogback gravestones, which are much more commonly found way up in the north with very heavy Scandinavian settlement. And actually, the collection in Cornwall, which is 5, of which I'd say 4 are pretty definite, and 1 might be a later one because it's very undecorated. It's like quite triangular. Is probably the biggest single location collection outside of the northwest in Scotland, where they are relatively common. So you do have. It looks like people do stay and continue, living in Cornwall. And it's really interesting because then you get these little moments where this population, this area, has big impacts on the wider British story. For example, the St. Brice's Day Massacre, which again I think your listeners will be familiar with. One of the things that sets Athelred the Unready off is that he made a Viking the earldom of Devon. So he put Palig the Dane as the earldom there. We don't really know why, because it's a pretty senior position. It's, as I said, it's an agriculturally very rich area. Devon also has tin mining, things like that. One reason might be if there was a significant Scandinavian population in Cornwall and in Devon, they might have felt it was, beneficial to have somebody like that. But whatever the reason, Palig betrays him as soon as a Viking fleet rocks up, literally immediately, goes off and raids. And that betrayal, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it gets written up in detail that, despite all the gifts of housing and blah, 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 Palig betrayed him and all the rest of it. And then the next year is the St. Brice's Day Massacre.
Yeah.
It's almost like this is the straw that broke the camel's back, and it happens far in the southwest of Britain.
It's like, don't piss me off, guy. It's like you're going to pay for it.
Perhaps he was trying to emulate the French king, who brought the Rollo into Normandy, but he just wasn't ready to handle the consequences.
Yeah.
That's a terrible dad joke. Alert! Ethelred the Unready. Oh boy, that was bad.
Oh.
But yeah, and as I say, you get these random minutes. As I said, the raid on Padstow might have been Olaf Tryggvason. The reason we say that is we know he was raiding in the Irish Sea around that time. His saga talks about despoiling the lands of the Bretons or Bretlanders, things like that. And we have a story later on which talks about his conversion, and that occurs on the Scilly Isles, which are off the coast of Cornwall.
Right.
So he lands there with his fleet, having burnt and pillaged and done various Viking things. And he hears that there's a hermit monk who can see the future. So he decides he's going to test this guy. He sends out one of his men dressed up like him to this hermit. And this hermit goes, "You're not the king, get out of here," basically. And then Olaf, suitably impressed, goes, "All right, great." Wanders over. The hermit tells him he will be the great king of Norway. Everything will be great. But by the way, your captains are about to betray you, so you should probably look out for that. And sure enough, Olaf goes back to his ship. His captains try to kill him. He kills them because, again, he's this Olaf Tryggvason. He's pretty good at this whole Viking and fighting thing. And then he converts to Christianity, presumably covered in gore, but he does then convert to Christianity and becomes this kind of proselytizing figure in Norway afterwards. And again, it off the coast of Cornwall, this southwest Britain.
See, this is like reminding me of like the mashup of 2 other stories. The first part of it sounds, when he's going to the person who to look at the future, sounds to me like the rehashing of Alexander the Great going to the Oracle, right? And then the second part is like sort of good Christian hagiography, right? Where it's like he saw the light and became Christian, and then went and tried to force everybody else to be Christian back in Norway. Oh, they didn't foresee his death in the sea or in the fighting or whatever. Oh, that's too bad. He was an oar walker too. That same saga, I think it talks about him walking on the oars.
I mean, his saga is pretty intense if you read the whole thing. Like, he goes everywhere and does them it's pretty full on, pretty much what you would expect from like a stereotypical almost Viking.
And then he sends Leif Erikson off to go and convert the Greenlanders, and he's a busy guy. It was only rained for 5 years.
Did I ever tell you about the I think it was one of the big networks, could have been History Channel, and they had me audition to be one of their talking heads, which was cool. And this was just after COVID, I think. And they had me answer a couple of questions about various things. There's going to be some show about, I forget. It was just kind of the weird and wacky parts, So they asked about the Blood Eagle, and I got excited, and I was like, "Well, it probably wasn't a thing, but here's what might make it a thing." And and then they asked me about the Viking saint. And I said, "Oh yeah, Saint Olaf." And I start going off, and then they're, "No, no, 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 that's not him." Well, what other Viking saint was there?
Yeah.
And they didn't answer my question, and then I got disqualified from being a talking head on their show, probably because
Mm.
of that. Is what I gathered. And
You were
and I
right.
look and then I looked it up, and it was that that guy. It was one of the Anglo-Saxon priests that got shot by
Oh, Edward.
Yeah, King
yeah.
Edward.
No,
Is it
not King.
Edward?
It wasn't King Edward. It was the monk. It was
Uh,
whoever who, or maybe it was. I don't remember.
yeah.
Is so in Bernard Cornwell's book, they shoot him, right? Like they're like, if you think
Yeah,
your God can protect you, we'll shoot.
Yeah,
And they
that's
fill him full of
Edward.
arrows. Okay, so
yeah.
it was him.
Or
That's who they were.
Edmonds.
But that's who they were.
It's an Ed. I can't remember
Yeah,
off the
and
Yeah.
top
they
of my
call him
head.
the Viking Saint, right? And I was like, how can you
No,
call him the Viking Saint?
he's
If you
not.
say if you say the Viking Saint, it implies the person you're talking about is a Viking.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Edward was not a Viking. I was like, oh well, whatever. You know what? I don't want to be on your show.
yeah, but yeah, no. So he's King of East Anglia. So basically, he. I think it's supposed to be that they told the Vikings the story of another like Saint Martin or something, a
No,
Roman
Saint
saint.
Sebastian.
Saint Sebastian. Thank
Yeah, the
you.
guy who took all the arrows.
Yeah, and
Um,
then the Vikings decide. The story goes the Vikings decide to recreate this. Obviously, the
yeah,
king was not arrow proof,
right. Yeah.
but then they ditch his corpse, and a wolf leads the priests there. Wolves feature a lot in British mythology, so even Saint Petroc, who's one of the local saints, is actually his saint day today, the 4th of June. Is supposed to have tamed a wolf in India, despite the fact he mostly spent his life in Devon and Cornwall, from all reports. Wolves are always around, but yeah, they lead the priest to I think it's Edmund. I think you're correct. Edmund's body, and then it's like unmarked, other than all the arrows sticking out of him. So he becomes a saint, and is a really like popular pilgrimage site for a while.
That's gonna be that's one of the one of the requirements so to be sainted is you have to have achieved so many miracles, and actually some of them have to be posthumous. And
Yeah.
so I guess taming a wolf long distance could be
Tamed a
conceived
wolf in India. Wow.
when he was in England.
It it must have come over with that little Buddha statue they found in Burqa.
No.
You brought something up. You used the word Bretland, and now this one's an interesting one. I have an essay from 1989 from Neil Price about the Vikings in Brittany specifically. I think he did
Yeah.
his doctoral thesis on that. And he talks about the Viking point of view, and we have this word Bretland that shows up in Icelandic sagas and so forth. But it's unclear what they're talking about. It could be Wales, it could be Cornwall, it could be Brittany. So what have you encountered looking into this? Is it of any consequence for anything that you do, or is it something that you've looked into?
Yeah, so we've looked into it a little bit. I think basically to the Vikings, again, when we're talking about the early medieval period, this idea of countries is still a little bit new, really. I mean, you enter the early medieval period, there's no England, there's no Scotland, there's no Wales, and eventually there is, but actually for a while it's not really about that. And even kingdoms as they are much more almost personality led. So you have a king who you're following, you're like the war band of this dude. You're not necessarily this is my country kind of thing. So I think for the Vikings, a lot of time they identify by the broad strokes. So like, you have Circland, which is where the people who speak Arabic live, and you have Bretland is like the people who speak Welsh or speak this weird language that we don't know. Because, for them, particularly, they were pretty good at getting on with different people. I mean, they did a lot of raiding and killing and murdering and all the rest of it. They also were traders. They traded in the Middle East. They traded in Russia. They were trading with the Irish and with the Welsh and the Cornish and the North and the Britons of Strathclyde, which is basically an area in southern Scotland today, which is Brittonic in this time, not Scot-Irish. So yeah, it's kind of this idea of, well, you kind of speak that language, so I'm just going to call you're that. Is Bretland, and it's very similar to like in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, like I said before, they use Walas to just mean the people who are speaking the British language. Obviously, that's where our modern word Welsh comes from, but for them, it's very context specific. So, like if you're talking about Mercia, when they say Walas, they probably mean the Cymry or the Welsh, as we would call them today. If we're talking about sort of Wessex or Exeter, that sort of area, it probably means the Cornish, but it is completely context specific. And similarly in Brunanburh, this gets very confusing because obviously you have the Britons of Strathclyde, but you also have like what the Welsh of Hywel Dda and things like that. So there's lots of moving pieces who might all be using the same terminology to describe them.
So did that answer your question, CJ?
Yeah, could it also be that, and I'm just thinking out loud now for fun. I'm wondering if there's also an element of, they didn't have maps. No one was taking geography classes, and so really all they had was, as we discussed with Dr. Tom Horn about the what was that called? What's the knowledge, right? The knowledge of how to get places,
Yeah,
which
like
is really
communication, intel, and all that.
and
Yeah.
and I wonder if some of this is like a kind of the uneducated reduction of places that they like to go, kind of like how you'll have people here in the US who'll just kind of broadly say, "Oh, Europe," and they to them it's
Yeah.
just one big nebulous place. And there's, but once you get there, it's like France is very different from Germany, is very different from Czech Republic. It's oh no, it's Czechia now. But they, it's and they're very different. So I wonder if it's a bit of a reductionism where they just go, "Oh, Bretland in general, anything Celtic." And then from there, then they can once, and then if they want to get more detailed, they can, but there's not really a big reason to because Halfdown over there knows how to get to those places. He's in charge of that knowledge, right?
Yeah.
For me, all I care about is, and also I wonder, given some of the activities that they were doing, if it was a little bit of a dehumanizing effort as well. Like it's kind of like don't name the pig, right? Because otherwise you'll get attached to it and you don't want to, kill it. I wonder if there's an element of that where it's like I don't want to focus too, like oh, what do they call themselves? I don't care what they call themselves because I'm not going to treat them well.
I think you probably there is a point there because obviously we also have a disconnect, right, between the people who actually said and did these things and the people who eventually wrote it down. So there's also probably a translation issue where you're talking about like if you've ever been like in a bar with somebody who wants to tell you about their gap year or whatever, and they're like talking about all these like, oh, I went to Koh Samui and then I went to Bangkok and this, like Thailand. Okay, you went to Thailand. I'm just gonna write down like this and then here. Like they might just not care really. They want to just kind of get on. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, the other thing is, particularly when you're talking about the early raids, they didn't really go that deep into these places. So, if you're landing on the shores of Wales or you're landing on sort of northwest England or western Cornwall, I mean, the other thing is they all look kind of similar. They're all very like granite landscapes that so is actually Brittany. It's you can definitely see a kind of common geography when you go through it as well. That they might just kind of be like, well, the people are speaking Welsh and there's a lot of granite around. We'll call it Bretland and move on and like get the raid done, get back in the ship and go. So yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of reasons to just be vague included in there.
Although actually, I think one of the things you just said, struck something with me where it's like maybe it's not the whole sort of simplification of, okay, I'm just going to write Thailand, but maybe it's the actual like feelings / interpretation, whatever, of the chronicler. Like, oh,
Yeah.
it's those people. What I don't like them, so this is how I'm going to write it.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe as the chronicler was hearing like for all the stories, it's like, yes, then we went into Brittany, we talked to the Bretons, and then we went to Cornwall and talked to the Cornish, and then we went to Wales and talked to the Welsh, and then and then the chronicler's like, okay, Bretland. It's all the same. Because he's never been anywhere. He's not the chronicler wouldn't have been the traveled person.
Yeah.
Right. If you think about it.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah. No, and that's one of the key things because you're dealing with things so far away that are written down, somewhere completely different in a different time almost.
Yeah.
Well, so John, what is actually the because I'm unaware of this like in any kind of detail. What is the conversion story of Cornwall? I mean, how long is we get pagan tribes out there, and when does that shift?
I'm gonna have to go back to the migration period. I pulled it back to Vikings, but I'm gonna have to dive back now.
Yeah.
So pretty much immediately post-Roman, as far as we can tell. So what's interesting about Cornwall in the southwest, it's sometimes called the Land of Saints because there are a lot of saints. So just to clarify this, there are two competing patron saints. So there's Saint Piran, who is the more famous, the flag, the black with the white cross.
Brian?
That is Piran, P-I.
Okay. Brian.
Yeah, he's the more famous. He's pretty much the national saint of Cornwall. But as I said, Saint Petroc, whose feast day is today, is another competing national saint. And then you have lots and lots. You've got Saint Neot, Saint Clare, Saint Austell, Germanus. There are all these different saints. There's literally almost every village that isn't named Trepol or Pen is named Saint something or Lan something, which is a early Cornish word meaning the enclosure or the holy space of this person.
All these people martyred in Cornwall?
No, they just came and preached in Cornwall. It's quite funny because a lot of the saint stories we have are written down about Cornwall and Devon, particularly, are written in the 14th century in a book which is now in the Gotha Ducal archives in Germany. And why that's funny is that it was written in Tavistock, which is a town in Devon, again, quite close to Plymouth, sort of a little bit north. It was written right around the time that Devon was trying to get its stanary parliament. So these are parliaments which took royal powers because they were run by the tin miners. So that's how important the tin trade was. They got royal power deferred to them. So it's basically all these stories of all these local saints written in this book. And they get really crazy, even by the standards of sort of hagiography. So, like, these saints are being chased by Cornish chieftains' daughters across the moors and all this sort of stuff. But what we do see, as I say, is we do have these old churches. We have Lan. So, like Lanavit, for example, is actually the church in the pagan enclosure, is the full name when you translate it from Cornish. But all of this happens very, very early on. One of the things that drives conflict with the Anglo-Saxons is that the Cornish are so committed to this Christianity that they have been taught, mostly by Irish missionaries, that they stick with things like the calculation of Easter and the tonsure, so the way you cut your hair as a monk, after the Synod of Whitby, so after most of the northern Welsh or Celtic churches have accepted the Roman method, the Cornish are still doing it the other way. So this guy called Aldhelm, who's a very famous West Saxon bishop, writes a very, very prissy letter to King Geraint of Daemonia, where he uses all of his florid Latin to kind of basically passive-aggressively tell him to sort these priests out or Wessex will attack. He does things like, it's very deferential, it's very like, oh, my lord of the Western, blah, blah, blah. But then it slips into like calling it a province, not a kingdom. So it's sort of insinuating that it's lesser than Wessex. It happens quite soon after there's a battle that the Daemonians lose. So yeah, the Christianity actually drives a conflict with the West Saxons. And that probably explains why when the Vikings do arrive, or helps to explain why the Cornish didn't hesitate to work with basically pagans or heathens, because to them, potentially still, even after this had all been resolved, the West Saxon church was still illegitimate compared to their own church. And this continues to be a source of conflict. And it's one of the best indicators that actually West Saxons don't take over Cornwall after that battle of Hingston Down. We have things like when Alfred's son, Edward, he founds a bishopric at Crediton, the place where Ecgbert was previously, and he leaves money to the bishop specifically to visit the Cornish. And the quote, when translated from Latin, is "because stubbornly they resist the truth." So it's still driving this argument even in that time period. And it's not till Athelstan. So Athelstan comes in, and he then reinstates a bishop of Cornwall. Specifically at St. Germain's, which is one of the largest monasteries. He puts a Cornishman in that post. And actually, you can see that kind of diplomacy there, where he is saying, okay, look, it didn't work. Both Alfred and Edward tried to put in other people to be Bishop of Cornwall based in Exeter or Crediton, and it doesn't seem to have worked. You can have your bishop, you can have your nobility, but I am the boss. You're underneath me. And that's the point where we start seeing charters appear. We start seeing Cornish nobles use English names in official documents and things like that. So for all these sort of centuries of fighting and trying to force their way through, it's only after Athelstan just takes the more olive branch approach that we actually see progress.
Interesting.
Well,
was it the Lion of Daemonia? Is that what you said before, that woman?
The lioness.
That's the name I was trying to remember. CJ,
Yeah.
that's a character for a future book, The Lion of Daemonia.
Yes. And there's the French equivalent, La Dame Noé. Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah.
That'd be good.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I'm just about out of time.
No worries.
But John, this has been wonderful. I just want to add, if you've seen The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and there's a whole part in the beginning where Arthur Dent's talking to his, love interest, and then she's like, "Let's go somewhere." Where? Madagascar. He says, "Oh, can't we go somewhere closer, like Cornwall?" And they make it sound like it's the most boring place in the world. But after this conversation, I'm like, I want to go to Cornwall.
Well, I mean, it is wonderful. It's genuinely a very fascinating place, particularly for early medieval history. You can also come see Tintagel Castle, supposedly Arthur's birthplace. But in reality, what you're looking at is Earl Richard of Cornwall's attempts to make a 13th century tourist trap, basically.
Was it a 19th? So it was a 19th century guy?
No, this is 13th century. This is right. This
He
is
is
medieval.
13th century also.
But
Okay.
he became the Earl of Cornwall and basically inherited Tintagel, which evidence now shows was probably occupied into the 11th century. But then the causeway between the mainland and it collapsed. And I don't know if somebody sold him this land or something, but he built the castle you see today on it. Despite it having no strategic importance at this point whatsoever, and tried to kind of sell this idea of like it's Arthur's birthplace, blah blah blah, which was very successful because that's still where it's being marketed at today.
Look, everyone, this is the room where Uther Pendragon raped Igraine.
Yeah.
Oh wow, that's amazing.
Pretty much, yeah.
What's next for you, John? Are you writing another book? Are we gonna? I'd love to have you back on the show. I still have like 12 questions I didn't get to ask today.
So I'm working on a couple historical fiction books about Cornwall, particularly at the sort of 8th century when these conflicts are happening. But I'm also researching specifically the Vikings in Cornwall and the sort of Scandinavian presence. If any of your readers are on Facebook, you can find my reenactment group Morvleydh, which is, I will spell because it's a Cornish word, Morvleydh. And we have things like a map where you can see all the Viking finds, all the Viking stonework, specifically in Cornwall, using Google Maps and things like that. We try and put resources out there just to highlight how interesting this period is in the Southwest, because it isn't often talked about, and it really should be.
Yeah, share the link with us, and we'll put the link to the Facebook page in our show notes.
Cool. Yeah, no problem.
Cool. Awesome.
Right. Well, thanks for coming on the show. This was an absolute pleasure, and I hope we'll get to do it again and expand on some of this.
Very happy to. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, cool.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.